I am very proud to have the honor today to introduce Governor Baker. I was appointed as executive director on the same day that you took office, so I see our legacies as intertwined. To date, I think we're doing a pretty good job. What about you? Good. January 8th. And on a more serious note, I do want to say how exciting it is to have the governor of the Commonwealth as the honorary chair of the White Ribbon Day campaign. The support, initiative, and commitment that the governor and the lieutenant governor and your administration offers us to preventing sexual and domestic violence greatly impacts survivors, their future, and our communities across the state, and it's really, really tremendous. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce Governor Charlie Baker.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. I was introduced to this issue in a serious way back in the 1990s when I served in the Weldon-Cellucci administration. And I was introduced to it by the Lieutenant Governor, Paul Cellucci, the late Paul Cellucci, who I believe introduced many people in Massachusetts to the issue of domestic violence. It was something that was deeply personal for him, and he set up the first domestic violence task force chaired by a statewide elected official shortly after Bill Weld and Paul Cellucci took office in 1991. And that task force did and by the way, he never missed a meeting. He chaired he didn't send a surrogate, he didn't send a delegate, he sent himself to every single one of those meetings. And I asked him one time why he always made sure that this was an immovable item on his calendar. And he said, if everybody knows that I'm going to be there, they're going to be there too. And that was exactly the way it worked. And that task force accomplished many, many objectives, but the three biggest ones, in addition to raising awareness, was for the first time every single year, there were financial increases in programs, services, and especially supported housing for women who are dealing with domestic violence and crisis issues. Second, it was a great platform on which to pass a number of first-in-the-nation pieces of legislation that were passed here in the Commonwealth to protect women and to help women dealing with these circumstances and these situations. And the third was it meant that this issue never left the public discourse as long as he was in office. And I would be remiss, especially as I look out at this audience and realize most of you are young enough to be my kids, if I didn't bring up the work of Paul Cellucci on this issue. The second thing I wanted to say is how much we appreciate not just your presence today, but your work day in and day out on this issue. This is one of those issues that explodes into the public domain when there's a horrible tragedy. And in fact, I think many people would argue that the success of Speaker DeLeo and former President Murray and many of the leaders in the legislature on getting Chapter 260 passed in 2014 came about as a result of the horrible tragedy associated with the Remy case. Which is why it's so important that we continue to maintain what I would describe as a front and center, permanent approach to this issue. Lieutenant Governor Polito currently chairs the Sexual Awareness and Domestic Violence Task Force here in the Commonwealth. Most of the work that's done by that group is done by people who are quite familiar with these issues, and I'm also pleased to say that Attorney General Maura Healey has been deeply involved in it as well. But when you talk about a circumstance or a situation in which 240 women have been killed by men they knew in certified acts of domestic violence in Massachusetts over the course of the past 10 years, this remains an issue that deserves to be front and center. So I want to thank you all for being here today, and I especially want to thank you all for continuing to carry on the work when you walk out the door and go back into your communities. Now, Deb, this is the official part of the ceremony. And by the way, there's a really long speakers list, so I'm trying to be brief. I hope you appreciate that. It's a proclamation. Here, I'll put it right in front of Deb's face so no one can see her. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but there's a couple parts in here I think are important. Whereas violence against women and gender-based violence are human rights violations, and these abuses are obstacles to efforts for peace and gender equity in all societies around the world. Whereas Jane Doe launched this primary prevention campaign in Massachusetts to call upon all men and boys, regardless of age, race, religion, political affiliation, profession, gender identity, sexual orientation, or any other characteristic, to make both a personal and public commitment to being part of the solution in ending violence against women and all gender-based violence. And whereas the Massachusetts White Ribbon Day campaign invites us to reimagine the norms associated with manhood as valuing respect, compassion, and nonviolence as an antidote to the abuse of power in relationships in society. So on this one in particular, I want to tell you one quick story. Sorry, it's kind of what we do. I traveled around a lot with Paul Cellucci when he was promoting this issue in the early 1990s, and I visited a number of supported housing programs. And I remember in particular visiting one program, and I met a woman there who actually was still missing several teeth from where she'd been hit by her husband. And I just asked her to tell me her story. And so she started talking, and I don't remember a lot of what she said because I was so horrified by the messages she was delivering, but there's one thing she said I'll never forget, because I'm quite sure it's been said many, many times before that and since. She said, "I'm not exactly sure how I got here. It just happened." I'm not exactly sure how I got here. It just happened. These are acts not just of violence, but they're acts of oppression most of the time. And they are delivered with great force and regularity by men who are taking advantage of someone who doesn't quite know how they got here. It just happened. Shame on them, because they certainly don't represent what I believe, or what any of you believe, or what most people believe it means to be a man. And it's important we never let the bad guys win. So with that said, I'm going to finish this. Whereas over 630 men in Massachusetts have already signed on as White Ribbon Day ambassadors, and over 93 communities have signed on as White Ribbon Day affiliates, now therefore I, Charles D. Baker, Governor of the Commonwealth, do hereby proclaim March 3rd, 2016 to be White Ribbon Day. Congratulations, Deb.